Hi, this is Matt Wolpe from Laney Carpentry. Today we're going to talk about carpentry in general and kind of zoom out and talk in broad strokes about some of the different kinds of approaches and careers within carpentry. We're going to talk a little bit about wood as a material, and then I'm going to show you a few examples of projects that we built at Laney so you get a better sense of our department. Starting out, wood. Wood is not just one thing that you just go to the wood store and buy. Wood breaks down into different categories. And as a beginner, it's good just to know in broad strokes what these categories are. So, for starters, wood is typically either solid wood or plywood. If it's solid wood, it's going to break down even further into hardwood and softwood. If it's plywood, it'll break down directly into construction grade or furniture grade. Hardwood is typically furniture grade. Softwood is typically construction grade, although there are some furniture grade cuts of softwood. So when you look at a piece of wood, your first determination should be, is it solid wood? Is it plywood? And moving down from there is, if it's solid wood, wondering if it's hardwood or softwood. And then for all of these categories, wondering if it's construction grade or furniture grade. Starting with solid wood comes from a tree, comes from a log rather, and gets milled with a saw. Might look like something like this. There's different strategies for milling a log, and we'll talk a little bit about those, but this is one way that a log might get cut up into boards. Back in the day, they used to have what's called a pit saw. That's a two-handled saw, one person on either end, and typically the person below was in a pit. In this case, they're above ground, and that's how you milled a log into lumber. So I show this just so you get a sense of the intense amounts of labor that went into creating lumber out of logs, particularly back before there was power tools. And I think it's good to appreciate how much work went into those. Lumber yards, or mills rather, used to be on a river, and they floated the logs down the river right on up that ramp and into the mill to get cut up. So that was kind of the workflow of going from cutting down a tree, floating it down a river, and then cutting it up in a mill. And there were loggers that used to manage these trees as they flowed down the river. That's where the term log jam comes from. Sometimes logs would build up and get stuck. So it was a logger's job to actually literally walk out there and unstick the log jam. And that was a dangerous job. So another case of jobs that we don't really see anymore, but were really hazardous, were really hard. But that's how we used to get logs downriver. Nowadays, you can actually buy a portable mill, and in this case, the log is stationary, and the mill has a bandsaw that travels on a gantry and mills the log into boards. This particular one is portable so that it hooks up to a trailer, or rather a truck, and you can tow it anywhere you want. So cut down a tree somewhere, tow your mill there, and mill it up into boards right on the spot. That's the capability that we have now. This is an example of one of those bandsaw mills, cutting a log into, in this case, it's cutting a square first, and then it's going to cut different size dimensional lumber from there. It's a video I'm going to skip over, but shows the different steps that a log goes through, from a raw log to a finished piece of lumber. So when we're looking at solid wood, we're going to look at construction grade softwood and furniture grade hardwood. We're carpenters in our department, and so we don't talk or use too much of the furniture grade hardwood. We may when we're doing the finished details of a house, but typically for carpenters, we use construction grade softwood. Softwood and hardwood are differences that are based on the tree that that wood comes from. And the main distinction is that softwood is coniferous, meaning that it comes from a conifer tree, also known as an evergreen type tree, whereas hardwood comes from a deciduous tree, meaning that the leaves on a hardwood tree fall off in the winter. Examples of softwood or coniferous trees are fir, pine, spruce, redwood. Examples of hardwood or deciduous trees are maple, cherry, walnut, mahogany, and ash, but there's many different kinds in addition to that. The main difference is that softwoods are literally softer. They grow faster and typically have a less dense grain, whereas hardwoods are literally harder. But there are some exceptions to this, and it kind of it translates to all aspects of the building and construction trade where things aren't quite as simple as they might seem at first. So in this case, typically, balsa wood is a hardwood because it comes from a deciduous tree. Whereas it's not actually hard, it's quite soft if you've ever made a balsa wood model out of it, but it technically is a hardwood. So there's exceptions to all these rules, but generally softwood is softer and hardwood is harder. Another important thing to know about wood is the grain direction. And in this case, the most important thing is the end grain. If you think of the end of a bundle of straws, that's similar to how grain functions in wood. For one thing, it's easy to separate those straws if you put in, let's say, a nail from that side. For another, it soaks up moisture more easily on the end grain than in the long grain or the quarter grain. So we're mindful of end grain, and we just want to know always how we're approaching the end grain. This is true in carpentry and in furniture making. As I said, there are different ways to mill up a log. One is plain sawn. That's very typical for softwood lumber. And then there's two variations on quarter sawn wood. These are more select and premium products and are typically sought after by furniture makers. But just to give you a sense of the differences in approaches to a log and milling that into lumber. Another way that the building and construction industry is extremely confusing is understanding wood sizes, particularly in standard softwood lumber. When you order a 2x4 from the lumberyard, you don't actually get 2 inches by 4 inches. You get 1.5 by 3.5. So it's been standardized and is uniform across the board, any lumberyard you go to nowadays. Whereas before you could actually get a 2 inch by 4 inch, but there was a lot of variation as well. So 2x4 that you ask for is actually 1.5 by 3.5. A 2x6 is 1.5 by 5.5. So those are both 1/2 inch smaller than they say they are. Where it gets confusing is when you go up to a 2x8, a 2x10, and a 2x12. A 2x8 is 1.5 by 7.25. 2x10 is 1.5 by 9.25. And a 2x12 is 1.5 by 11.25. So it's a 1/2 inch smaller in the in the thickness, and 3/4 of an inch smaller in the width. So this is just something that carpenters just learn over time, is the actual dimension of a piece of lumber. versus what it's called, and there's some nuance there. On the very right, there's a 4x4, which is 3.5 by 3.5. It's just another illustration of the difference between nominal size and the actual size. So what you actually get is always a bit smaller than what it says it is. Moving on to plywood. Plywood breaks down into two categories, construction grade and furniture grade. And there's lots of kinds of plywood that are in between these two grades. And the prices can vary quite a bit. For instance, the pine CDX plywood on the left, which is suitable for construction, might be 20 something dollars a sheet. Whereas the furniture grade apple ply on the right is potentially $120 a square foot, or sorry, a sheet. And there's lots of different sheets in between. So for construction grade, we're going to use products that are closer to what's on the left than on the right, but they're all the same, made the same way. So plywood starts with the log, and they peel the bark off the log. That's the first step, and then they peel away, almost similar to how you unspool a roll of toilet paper. They make thin veneers, and these veneers typically are around 1/16 of an inch thick, but they vary. And the veneers are stacked on top of one another with glue in between, and then pressed down with hydraulic pressure to create a really strong and stable board. So as an overview, comes in as a log, goes through a veneer lathe, gets cut up into different veneer sheets. Those sheets get dried, patched, and then heat pressed together to create a strong board. And the strength comes from the alternation between the alternating grain direction between each veneer face. So for instance, in this example, you see a sheet of plywood made out of 5 plies, and each veneer is perpendicular to the veneer that's above it or below it. And that grain alternation plus the glue plus the hydraulic heat press adds a great deal of strength and also makes it more stable and less likely to warp in situations of differential moisture. So it creates something that's extremely strong and extremely stable. When you go to the lumberyard, you might see a rack like this with all different kinds of plywood sheets. And as you go on in this course, you'll be able to know what the differences are and be able to pick out the actual sheet that you need. This is a good time to also talk about the distinction between a lumberyard and a place like Home Depot, for instance. This shot is from a lumberyard. And what you do at a lumberyard is you go in and you ask for what you need. And those folks help you take it off one of these racks and load it onto your car or truck. And I can't stress enough how much of an advantage that is. But it does mean that you kind of have to know what you need before going in. So what we want to do in this class is break down those barriers and make you feel comfortable and welcome going into a lumberyard and getting better quality products and also getting help with the things that you buy. Moving on into different approaches to carpentry. So there's rough carpentry and finished carpentry. Those typically are two different trades. Usually someone is a rough carpenter or a finished carpenter. However, plenty of people do both. And I think it's a good, where you're at in your education, it's a good time to try out both and do some rough carpentry and do some finished carpentry. There's a different approach and there's a different tolerance, where with rough carpentry, you have a little more leeway to make mistakes. With finished carpentry, there's quite a bit more attention to detail. If you're a rough carpenter, you're typically either a residential carpenter or a commercial carpenter. There's some exceptions, and there's some people that do both. But generally, it's one or the other. Residential is building houses. Commercial is building high rises, office buildings, also condos and apartments. The main difference is that commercial construction is typically a union job, whereas residential construction is typically working for a general contractor, independent general contractor. There's also a lot of other differences as far as the scale and size of the project and how repetitive the work that you're doing is. Rough carpenter might do something like this, where this is a wall that's framed that is getting braced to be plumb and temporarily braced until other parts of the building come together and hold it all together. And so essentially, a rough carpenter builds the skeleton of the building. This is parts of the building that you don't actually see when you walk into it and it's finished. However, this is what's holding up the building. So in this case, these are rafters that are holding up the roof. So a rough carpenter deals with all of those structural pieces of wood that hold up the building, but you don't actually see them. This is what it might look like when a rough carpenter is handing a job site off to another tradesperson, where all the roof trusses are in, all the walls are framed, doors are framed. In this case, the plumber and electrician also came through. And it's ready to go to the next stage of construction. But none of these things you'll actually see when you walk into the finished building. I like to show sawhorses because that's where we start out. It's kind of a classic intro to carpentry project, is creating your first set of sawhorses. Sometimes you're asked to do that as a tryout for a job. But sawhorses are just, I think, the perfect starting project where you learn the basics of cutting straight cuts, cutting angles, and assembling pieces together. And they're incredibly useful. For finished carpentry, this is where a carpenter installs and handles all of the pieces of wood that are visible on the inside of a house once it's finished. So in this case, a finished carpenter is actually installing some kitchen details, some cabinets. Finished carpenter might also build a staircase. In this case, this is a curving staircase, which is pretty tricky, and a good time to remind people that if you like detail and you really like things to fit together really nicely, you might be more of a finished carpenter than a rough carpenter. Stairs in particular can be extremely tricky. Another thing a finished carpenter might do is install the baseboard trim. The baseboard covers the gap between the floor and the drywall. So all the gaps that previous tradespeople leave in their building get covered up with trim. And so the finished carpenter takes care with that trim and makes it so that everything looks just so. On the left, you'll see another case of baseboard trim going in. In that case, it's going at a 45-degree angle. On the right, you'll see a handrail for some stairs. So that's another thing that a finished carpenter might install, something that you touch and interact with once the building is finished. Next, I'm going to just talk a little bit about carpentry at Laney. This was just a good day of color coordination on site. A couple projects that we've done in the last few years we're going to go over. One is the Wedge. The Wedge is a tiny house that we built for a tiny house competition in 2016. And the idea of the competition, it was a statewide competition, and it was to create a net zero tiny house, meaning that the house produced the energy that it consumed. So in this case, and in the case of all the houses, there were solar panels that were used to create the energy for the house. This was built on a 20-foot trailer, and it had a little angled wall as well. We had to bring up all these the landscaping elements and create a whole scene with our given lot, which was fun and um, really was a group effort of students and teachers pulling it together. So we ended up winning some awards. We won best furniture, best architecture, best design, best landscaping. There were some other ones. We did not win first place, however, which was a disappointment to somewhat, but we did place highest as far as the community colleges. We were third place overall behind Santa Clara and UC Berkeley. So I'm really proud of our team and the effort we put forth, and how we went up against the four-year universities, and our house ended up really nice. We got a giant check for an award. That was always a goal, getting a giant check. It was fun. Another shot of the landscaping. So in addition to making the house, we had to do a lot of other things in order to qualify for the competition. So it was a real effort, but I was happy with how it came out. Here's some shots of the inside. So there were actually two beds. We're sitting on one bed, looking at the other bed in this shot. And all the built-ins and furniture and cabinetry were made in-house at Laney. Another shot from below. There was a little couch underneath the main loft. This photo is just to show that we made all our decisions together, and it was truly a collaborative process. So for instance, picking a paint color. Students picked out different swatches of paint, and we voted on them and decided collectively what color the house should be. And I love that part. That part is fun, and it's part of the advantage, I think, of building in groups. Yeah. Some other construction shots. There was continuous insulation on the outside of this house to make it energy efficient. Moving on to another tiny house. This is called the Pocket House. There were two of these, actually. There was Pocket House M and Pocket House S. M is for medium, S is for small. And this is Pocket House M, had a kitchen and bathroom. This was built with funding from a grant from the city of Oakland to create a couple house prototypes for students that needed housing, students at Laney. And so we built this on a 16-foot trailer. We tried to make it as economical as possible, so we used pretty straightforward building materials. And it's currently being lived in by students, and was a success. There's some other shots of the Pocket House. Interior, again, was made by students at Laney. We had the bed on the entry-level floor so that someone who wasn't able to use stairs was able to sleep in the house. Some other construction shots. You'll be able to know by the end of this course what all these different materials are and why we chose them and all of that stuff. So it might look foreign now, but hopefully you'll get to know what each thing is. Just some action shots, putting on the trim. This was Model S, which is for small, and this one was more or less a studio, and lives next to Model M, a bedroom with insulated and weather tight, and there are the two of them together, side by side, 16-footer and a 12-footer, and still being lived in, thankfully. After that, we built a few, actually 10 by 12 structures, 120 square feet. That's the biggest you can build without a permit. This one actually went to the property of a Laney student. This was fully insulated, weather tight, actually had a mini kitchen, but was meant as a little office, backyard office studio, and turned out pretty nice. We used metal roofing and metal siding on the back wall. You can see that transition, different kinds of siding. And we moved it on a flatbed truck. So we worked with a person named Shed Mover. His business is called Shed Mover, and we didn't build this on wheels, but Shed Mover helped us pull it onto this trailer and move it on to site. So those are just a few examples of some of the smaller structures we built in my class specifically, and a little bit about wood as a material, and a little bit about the different kinds of approaches and trades within carpentry. My job this semester is to familiarize you with actually doing all those things and understanding how a building goes together, and obviously using tools in a safe and empowering way. So I look forward to doing that with you.